particular project about 15 years ago. So I want to start, I just want to get a sense first of kind of who's in the room and how I can kind of gear this talk the best. Just raise your hands, how many of you have been to Africa? Anywhere in Africa? Okay. And those of you who have your hands up, keep your hands up if you've been to West Africa. And have you been to Guinea-Bissau? Okay. But nobody's, okay. Not a surprise. Not very many people have. So I'm going to give a little bit of background to that region to start off with. And then just another kind of question on this. How many of you, you're all eating pizza, how many of you like rice? How many of you eat rice? Okay. How many of you like rice a lot? All right. And how many of you who really like rice a lot know where rice comes from? Maybe. Some maybe. All right, we might do a little bit of a quiz on that later. We'll see what happens. We'll see. There's not just one, it turns out. Okay, that helps. So what I'm going to do today, I'll run through kind of quickly some background on the place and then particularly on the people in Guinea-Bissau, is a small country in West Africa where I've been doing field work. I'll then kind of introduce the problem that I've been focusing on in terms of declining rain and what that means for declining rice production in this region, and then discuss some of the implications of that problem. And then I think what I'll do really as a kind of focus point in terms of trying to analyze some of this is just offer a few thoughts on what's at stake here. That is, even though most of you have not been to Africa and none of you have been to Guinea-Bissau, why it is that this might still matter to you. Even for those of you maybe who, did raise your hand and you like rice, right? Maybe why you can understand some aspects of rice in a sort of different set of dimensions here. So that's what I'll try to run through very quickly and then leave time, of course, for discussion. So let me just start with an introduction to the place where I did research. Okay, so is this going to be a pointer? Is there a pointer? Okay. All right. So this is Guinea-Bissau. It's bordered to the north by Senegal. This is the Republic of Guinea, often confused with Guinea-Bissau, often called Guinea-Conakry, based on its capital. It's a small and very diverse country right on the coast of West Africa here. Used to be called the Rice Coast or the Grain Coast during many centuries of European exploration and colonial rule in the region. It's a former Portuguese colony. It's the only former Portuguese colony in West Africa. The Portuguese, those of you who are not so familiar with European colonialism in this part of the world, Portuguese actually arrived among the Europeans first in this region, actually in the mid-1400s, and established trading posts there. There was a very, very long, protracted, several centuries of Portuguese and then increasingly French and British colonial rule in the area. And Guinea-Bissau actually won independence only in 1974. So that's a really, really long chunk of time, from mid-1400s to 1974. Portuguese is actually still the official language in Guinea-Bissau, but very few people speak it. And now there are, just to give a sense of the population, about 1.5 million people in the country, so very small, but again, diverse. Depending on who you ask, about 23 to 27 ethnic groups in a very small population. Most of the land, all along you can see here, most of the land is low-lying mangrove swamps. And there are no mountains. In fact, there's no word in most of the local languages for mountain, because people have never seen one. And this area to the east here is sort of flat, dry, a little bit more like the rest of the Sahel to the north. So the section where I have been conducting research is in the far northwest of the country, right around here. You see this little town called San Domingos. This area right on the Senegalese border is where the Jola ethnic group resides. And I have been working in a village just right around here, right in this section here, called Susanna or Essana, depending again on who you ask. About 2,000 residents. It's the central village in this area that connects a whole network of Jola villages. So very rural, quite isolated. You can see this is the sort of network of villages there. You don't have to worry too much about what that all looks like. And it's not an easy place to there. I'm constantly reminded of that every time I go back, like just this last time. It takes several days to get there, no matter where you start from. And it's an area that is mostly serviced and connected by a dirt road from that town, San Domingos. You sort of have to wait until a form of transportation like this comes along to get a ride down there. Again, it's mostly made up of these oil palm forests, very thick oil palm forests. There's no electricity, no running water. People live largely in mud houses, thatch roofs, spend most of their time in the forests and in the rice paddies. Now, when I first started going there in around 1999 was my first time in this area. I started living there in 2001, lived there for a little over 2 years, and then have been going back and forth since then. And when I first started going there, I lived with the local family and was adopted into this family, ate with them every day, joined in all of their agricultural and domestic routines. These are my credential and field work photos. This is transplanting rice seedlings from those oil palm forests that you saw, where they lay rice in nurseries and transplanting them into the inundated paddies. So I did all of the agricultural work with them, all of the domestic work. Does anyone, here's a quick question. Does anyone know what these are? Does anyone recognize these? And you can, I'll give you palm nuts. Nope. This is the fruit, and that's the nut. Anyone want? No. Nope, not cola. That would be further south. What? Nope. They're cashews. That's the cashew apple, sometimes called cashew fruit, and that's the nut. We never see a cashew in a shell here. They're all processed by the time we get them. But if you look at most of the former Portuguese colonies, Guinea-Bissau, Brazil, Mozambique, Angola, they are all cashew-producing, cash crop cashew-producing countries. The Portuguese brought cashews as a primary sort of cash crop export. And to this day, cashews have basically taken over the cash crop production in Guinea-Bissau, as they have in other former Portuguese colonies, where the cashews are actually hard to get out of the shell, and that's why they're not typically, you don't get them like peanuts you get in a shell here. It takes a lot of work to get them out of the shell, and what we do there is throw a bunch of them into a fire, burn them to a crisp, and then whack them really hard with a stick or what was a favorite object, my shoe often, and eat them. And they are a good source of protein and another kind of caloric intake for mostly rice-eating group. So a lot of cashew production. I was also, in addition to the family kind of domestic and agricultural routines, I was inducted into a women's work association. And I worked with them as a member in the rice paddies, in the forests, harvesting rice, planting rice, braiding thatch for roofs, making salt, et cetera, all of the activities that they do throughout the year. And then I also, as we do in anthropology, participated in a really wide range of community activities, from markets to ceremonies. This is a spirit shrine ceremony. I can talk about the basic aspects of the religion in a moment. A lot of parties where you see a lot of rice being eaten, and more parties and meetings. I'm going to flip through these pretty quickly, just giving you visual images of all of this, so then I can get to kind of what it all adds up to. Wrestling matches. Wrestling is the favorite sport in the region. And when I was just back this last time, there was an enormous, wonderful inter-village wrestling match that took a couple of days of being there. And they're just fabulous sites for sport and recreation, and then also a lot of ceremonial activity around them. These are the local wrestlers in the village where I lived. School, right, which has become increasingly important in the region. This is on a more recent return visit with my kids. There, health-related activities a lot of times, and weddings. That's a wedding. And funerals. I went to a lot of funerals, and if anyone's interested in that, I can certainly talk about that more. And again, just to give you a sense of what anthropologists do when we hang out for a few years in particular places, we really do a lot of hanging out and talking and drinking palm wine. Again, here's a cashew fruit, and in here is palm wine. Delicious. I drank a lot of it. It's just part of what everybody does on any given day, drinking more palm wine. And really just try to spend as much time with different segments of the population living in this area, from babies and kids, right? And older women, younger women, old men, chiefs. These are the ritual chiefs in the area. And found out very quickly upon living there that interviews, right, what most of us are sort of trained in doing when we do social science research interviews, aren't really conducive to Jola communicative mores. It's not how people talk to each other. It isn't really here either, but it's really sort of anathema to the way they talk about things and the way they find out about things for themselves. So a lot of what I was understanding, a lot of what I had to do to figure out kind of what was going on there came through casual conversation, right? A lot of different social contexts, a lot of talking to different people, hanging out with various folks there, and a lot of observation and participation in all of these kinds of realms. And so as I was living there, and I went to work each day in the forests and in the paddies, and I listened increasingly to my new friends, my neighbors, and became increasingly involved, right, through participant observation in the rhythms of their daily lives, I kept on hearing a consistent set of complaints. People would say, we can't do this anymore. Things aren't anything like they used to be. There's no rain anymore, and the rice will run out. And similar kinds of refrains, again and again and again, every day. And it actually took me a while to kind of figure out something's going on here. I knew something was going on in terms of a level of problem of sort of basic humanitarian concern, but something was going on here in terms of how rural rice farmers in this region were understanding their present moment by imagining and reimagining their past and by kind of projecting onto what their future might be. And that's how I started to kind of put together what's the main kind of research question I can involve myself in here that actually turned out to be nothing like the one I went into there doing. And that's a really typical thing for anthropology too, something to kind of keep in mind if you're interested in doing this. I went to this area with an entirely different topic in mind. And I found that what I was interested in and what I thought was relevant for there based on preliminary work was only a small piece of this much larger puzzle underway in the region. And I shifted my own research concerns to respond to the kinds of things that people really wanted to talk about and what they were really facing at the time. So now I was eating rice every day for every meal, often just rice every day for every meal, and spending most of my days every day doing some kind of agricultural work involving growing rice, right, or maintaining a kind of rice agricultural system. But I very quickly realized by living here, if you've seen all these pictures now, that rice for Jola and for other rice-growing groups in the region was much more than a kind of staple crop that they grew and ate. Right, after just a few months of living there, let's go back to this one, I had already become really deeply immersed in a life in which rice kind of dominates everything, dominates your actions, dominates your preoccupations, even sort of dominates your dreams. Again, I had eaten rice every day in a family context, but also in ceremonial contexts and parties like this one. I had seen unhusked rice. That's all of this here. If you haven't seen rice outside of a bowl before, used to decorate everything from funeral grounds to wedding parties, usually hung on these kind of cords connecting giant cottonwood trees. Here you see small sachets of rice, right here, encircling a young girl's waist at a neighborhood dance, and rice used, again, as a kind of headdress by the celebrants. This is in an intervillage wrestling match. And I listened, again, to my friends, to my neighbors there, as they spoke endlessly about rice. Now, when we think of rice as a food, right, as something that we eat, we can really clearly state, and it's quite obvious for this region, that everybody eats rice every day for every meal, and it's cliche that if you haven't eaten rice, you haven't eaten. Right? Everybody really feels this need to eat rice as part of sort of just feeling full. But again, as these examples show, rice is a lot more than this. In rice, I came to kind of understand, putting all the pieces together, what was going on in these different domains, that rice was kind of omnipresent in Jola economic, in social, and in symbolic life. It was there everywhere. It sort of tied all these things together. And in fact, Jola believe that they were created as a people in order to farm rice. They have a covenant, their understanding of their relationship to their religious world. They have a covenant between the supreme deity, called Emitai, and the Jola people. And the covenant is based on their hard work, on the Jola farmers' hard work in cultivating a crop, and Emitai, the supreme deity, sending them rain. That's how it works. That's the contract. When they would talk to me about the problems with rice, it was all grounded in this understanding in which rice played all of these different roles, and that it was fundamental to their understanding of how the world worked, what the relationship was between the supernatural and the natural world. So when they told me often that rice was sacred, evoked all of these different sorts of aspects. Now they, the people that I was talking to when I started living there and up till today, and their parents and their grandparents, used to have enough rice to not only stock their granaries and provision themselves throughout the year, but even use for all of these other ceremonial purposes, even just for decoration. That's how it was sort of customarily used in a lot of different occasions. As I was living there and gathering more and more information and doing household surveys and you know, sort of gathering kind of more what our understanding of evidence is about where did rice really stand in all of these kinds of places, I found that most families, starting in about the mid-1990s, and certainly through today, only ever increasingly today, don't have enough rice to last them through the year. They're not actually able to grow enough rice to last them through the year, and certainly not enough to cover all of these other ceremonial purposes. So again, my research has shifted at that moment and has continued to shift since then to explore how Jola are responding to these dramatic changes in their environment, in their economy, in their political landscape, and in their religious context. And a lot of these changes, especially the environmental changes like declining rainfall, now make it impossible for them to do the kinds of things that have defined them as a people, defined them as Jola for many, many centuries. Let me just take a step back from here. Let's look at rice for a second here. I want to come back to this question that I threw out there right at the beginning about rice. Most of you like rice. Some of you ventured to say that you might know where it comes from. Maybe let's just go right back there. Where does rice come from? Anyway, throw out what you think. Where does rice come from? Okay. Let's see what other people have to say. Yes. Rice comes from Vietnam. Okay. It is grown in California, and they actually send it to Asia, right? It's California rice. Okay, it comes from California. Where else? Rice paddies. All right, who has rice paddies? Now you can. Southeast Asia, great. Where else? East Asia. Okay. Costa Rica, yeah. Right, so they're trying to rice. Africa, no, okay. So these are all places that we know grow rice. California, a little bit more recently. East Asia, sure, it goes back a long time. Let me ask it a little differently. Where does rice originate from? Good guess. Take it. Okay. Yeah, not a lot of people do know that. And it's actually only recently that we've kind of figured out that there are two kinds of domesticated rice. Rice was independently domesticated, right, in East Asia, the rice that we most typically sort of imagine as rice, right, East Asian rice, and in West Africa, most likely along the Niger Delta. These were independent sites of domestication of rice. Now, for a very, 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 very long time, most people assumed that rice started in Asia and spread to the rest of the world. And it did spread from East Asia to the rest of the world, but the assumption was Africans couldn't have possibly have domesticated their own rice. They must have gotten it from the Asians. They must have gotten it either through Malaysian travel, Malaysian export, or even later through European trade, through the Portuguese, they must have brought it there. So it really wasn't until the 1960s, kind of botanical expeditions in the area, that people started to do analysis of the kinds of rice that they were seeing being grown in West Africa and found that it actually is a different species. Asian rice, Orisa sativa, right, that then has many subspecies, and African rice, Orisa glaberrima, are actually two separate species of rice. And they were domesticated under very different kinds of environmental conditions in those other places. Is that, you're nodding your head, all right. The archaeologist agrees. Rice cultivation actually developed in West Africa under very different climatic conditions than the present day. Right? The Upper Guinea coast was a lot wetter. The rainy season often lasted 5 or more months, typically from June to October. It's now kind of concentrated down to about 1 or 2 months of inundated rains, and that's quite a recent change. And it's now, after a lot of this sort of botanical evidence and more archaeological evidence in the region being done, it's now generally agreed, there's a general consensus that rice was domesticated around 3,500 years ago in West Africa, and that cultivating it in this, even then, tricky and unpredictable environment involved really highly sophisticated water management systems, cultivation techniques, and tools, all of which were in use long before European involvement in the region. This whole system, right, of this sort of water management, the irrigation techniques, the tools, has been called the West African Rice Knowledge System. Right? And it's actually been argued, if anyone's interested in this, quite controversially argued, that West Africans brought this system, this rice knowledge system, over to the Americas through the Atlantic slave trade, and influenced rice cultivation approaches in the Carolinas, especially what we know of the sort of famous Carolina rice, right, is actually West African rice cultivation techniques. In West Africa, back in West Africa, rice-growing populations were actually, at that time, very successful agrarian societies. For centuries, really, people in this region were considered to be rich with rice. Rice was a form of wealth, and it has been understood as contributing to the rise of pre-colonial African states, of really sort of powerful states. So again, remember when Europeans first started exploring this region in the 15th century, they called it the Rice Coast. It was definitive of the whole region. But all of this started to change during the colonial era, right? Because of colonial policies, first that required a shift away from food crops for local consumption to cash crops for European consumption. And then into the post-colonial era because of a de-emphasis on agricultural development towards much more urban kinds of modernization-oriented development. And so even though this area was once defined by really abundant rice production, the Upper Guinea coast saw a really dramatic increase in rice imports over the past half century. This is a port in Dakar in Senegal, all of this coming in, and who said Vietnam? Yes, right. So all of this rice is from Vietnam coming into West Africa, to the whole area of West Africa. Most of the rice that comes into this area now is from Vietnam, Thailand, some from India, some from China. But again, this was an area that was able to grow enough of its rice and even export some of it not so long ago. Now, since independence, which again in this region for Senegal and for other surrounding countries started in around the mid-1960s, for Guinea-Bissau 1974, the newly liberated African nation states really wanted to attain self-sufficiency in food production again. But right at that time, a lot of things kind of conspired against that, including kind of increased influence of cash economy, rapid demographic shifts, right? So we see rapid sort of urbanization happening at this time. And then again, a post-colonial focus on urban development. So all of that has really kept rural development on the back burner. And food imports, especially of rice, have only increased. On top of all of that, as if that wasn't enough, in the 1970s, especially the late 1970s, the Sahelian drought, which was a very, very powerful force environmental change in the area, And that plus the availability of cheaper rice on the international market because of the gains of the Green Revolution in Asia and Latin America made it even harder for rice growers in West Africa to kind of make ends meet. And then, as if that wasn't enough, farmers in this region began to feel the increasing effects of global climate change, especially in terms of the decrease in rain and the kind of condensing, shortening of the rainy season that they depended on so much to grow rice. This is a rain-fed kind of rice. Requires a sort of inundation of these paddies. So this all brings us kind of back or up to the late 1990s, early 2000s, when I was living in Guinea-Bissau, and my friends and neighbors in these Jola villages were telling me, we can't do this anymore. We just can't do it anymore. Now, let me shift a little bit here and talk about a couple of, so there have been efforts to address this problem. Recently, the most kind of well-known and well-funded effort along the lines of agricultural development in Africa, in the whole continent, has come under the auspices of the Gates Foundation. Does anyone know what this is? Yeah, have you heard? Yeah, so what they're trying to kind of do in terms of agricultural development in Africa. It's called AGRA. Yeah, it's Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. And the idea here is that Africa is the continent that missed out on the Green Revolution in the late 1960s through the 1970s in Asia and Latin America. And we need to do in Africa what we did in Asia and Latin America to kind of boost the agricultural economies up and move forward, again, towards sort of grand modernization schemes. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, actually much detail at all, about these efforts. I will say that I'm not particularly hopeful about them. Partly because they repeat many of the same mistakes of the first Green Revolution in terms of kind of over-reliance on science and on the market as the kind of keys to agricultural transformation. My main concern, particularly in this context, is that these sorts of approaches tend to kind of extract agriculture, right, and its product, its main product, food, outside of the social and the political and even the cosmological context in which agriculture is so deeply enmeshed. Right? And in doing that, in extracting it out and just trying to figure out, how to make the agricultural part better, they really miss the kind of multidimensionality that I've been talking about of how farmers see and understand and perform their work. And I think ultimately, this isn't just a kind of anthropological problem. It's not just because I think all things are connected, as a good anthropologist does. I don't think it's just because we need to value the culture. It actually, we've seen again and again in attempts like this, it actually tends to worsen the conditions of these would-be beneficiaries if this is done. So I've already explained how rice is so much more than this kind of subsistence crop that fills Jola bellies. Jola say regularly rice is sacred. And I think that what they mean when they say that rice is sacred, this is the phrase that I took as the title of my book on this, Sacred Rice. I think what they mean by this is somewhat along the lines of what the French social theorist, 19th century social theorist Marcel Mauss meant when he gave us this concept of the total social fact, the total social phenomena, it's sometimes called, in his most famous book called The Gift. Anyone read The Gift? Yes, yes. Anyway, you have, okay, so the gift comes up in a lot of different kinds of classes. It can be used as a teaching tool for all kinds of things. One of the things that I find it most valuable for is this concept of the total social fact, right? Which Marcel Mauss meant as something in any given society that connects all social spheres, right? It links all the kind of levels and dimensions of any given society. It's the sort of means through which Jola villagers present themselves to themselves and to others. It's like a mirror that they see themselves reflected in and that they reflect to others too. That's what a total social fact is, and rice really operates that way. It really links all of these spheres that I've talked about and all of these images where you see rice sort of appear visually. It's also doing a kind of work there to link all of these different kinds of things. But, and this is the very big but here, because they're on the front lines of global climate change, rural Jola are simply no longer able to grow enough of it to do that kind of work, right? So the questions that I've been exploring over the past decade or so have to do with this very conundrum. What happens when a total social fact changes? Right? How does something that's so totalizing, right, something that you now know has such a long and deep history in terms of where it emerged and how it emerged in this region, and such a complex set of roles, how did it disentangle itself from these spheres of social and religious and moral and economic and political and family life? Right? How did Jola raise their children? And how do they reorganize their social relationships? How do they even rethink what it means to be Jola? And rethink what the relationship is between the natural and the supernatural world, now that this contract that they have with their supreme deity, with Emitai, is no longer intact. These are kind of fundamental questions that are, in some ways, very old ones for anthropology, but they're happening in a very new set of circumstances, in a different context, right? And this predicament leads to what I've been calling a kind of structural uncertainty, right, that currently shapes Jola lives. Now, this is a bit of a tricky part, and I'll try to spell this out a little bit, and then again wrap it up. So let's get a little philosophical. None of us actually knows what's going to happen next, right? You could walk out this door, and you could, meet eye to eye with somebody and fall in love. You don't know; it might happen. Or you could go outside, get a little bit more morbid on this, and cross the street and get hit by a car. We just don't know what's going to happen, right? That's a kind of uncertainty that we all live with every day. And some of us cope with it better than others, and some of us have other ways of coping with it, right? Institutional ways or other sorts of psychological means of coping with it. When I talk about Jola uncertainty, it's not at that level, because none of us, right, can escape really that level of uncertainty. And I think it's pretty safe to say that Jola in this region have led lives very thick with uncertainty for many, many centuries. Again, this has always been a kind of unpredictable region in terms of rainfall patterns, et cetera, with other sorts of circumstances, and of course, many, many sorts of historical changes. So I'm not talking about the kind of uncertainty that has to do with kind of season-to-season questions about whether a particular crop, right, a particular harvest will suffice. Or even these kind of perennial questions, maybe that many of your parents are wondering of whether a particular child will succeed. There's a lot of uncertainty that goes into parenting, right? And you're all here trying to do your best to fulfill your idea of what you want to do, and your parents are wondering, can we be certain about what's going to happen with them? Those are questions that that's just part of the human condition. What I'm talking about is a sort of whole mode of being in the world that's coming into question. And there's a general precariousness, a general level of structural uncertainty about whether current techniques of social, right, and material reproduction can sort of fulfill their intended outcomes. Structurally, this system is in a moment of deep uncertainty. And so the beliefs and practices around livelihood and around personhood and around gender and around religion are all being challenged to the core. Let me just be clear about one other thing. I really don't think that the impasse here is one that pits progress against culture or modernity against tradition, right, or innovation against conservatism. Nobody in this region is just holding on to tradition for the sake of tradition. There's a lot of experimentation going on, a lot of innovation going on. Jola are not passive in the face of this dilemma. There are many, many ways that they're experimenting to, as they put it, to get their feet out of the fire. And the reactions and the coping strategies, very importantly, back to this kind of Mosian connection, the total social fact, don't isolate the material, rice. They don't just say, let's figure out what's going on with rice. They don't extract that out of this whole sort of web of relations. The reactions and the coping strategies that I've been seeing, the strategies that I've been seeing over the past 15 years, have to do with an attempt to connect that material to the ideal, to what it means to be Jola. And this is perhaps why you might be interested in this place, this problem, even if you're not particularly interested in this part of the world, even if you don't particularly like rice. Because, so even though I focused this talk on, I really think this story has something to tell us about many kinds of dynamics, many kinds of processes that go beyond this particular place and even this particular group of totally rice-obsessed people. Right? I'm still, again, I just came back. I'm not kidding when I say you eat every day for every meal. I'm like de-ricing right now as we speak. It's really very rice-obsessed. But here are a few reasons why I think this matters beyond the kind of focus on rice here. You're all here because of some interest in environmental issues, environmental studies. So I think especially in an era where we're seeing many people, rural and urban, confronting environmental and economic changes that challenge livelihoods, but also our lifestyles. Right? These stories of rural Jola farmers in Guinea-Bissau, I think, resonate with this larger story about acknowledging a disappearing resource base. Doesn't matter whether it's rice, it could be oil, it could be a post-industrial town, it could be whatever. But it's sort of this question about what happens when the very premises on which we've constructed not only our livelihoods, but what we think it means to be successful, what we think it means even to be a person, right, become challenged because of a shift in what we can access as a resource. One more point beyond that, I think this also has something, this case has something to teach us about how we understand and address what gets called an environmental problem, or an agricultural development problem, or even a resource crisis. Because, to be sure, absolutely, there are clearly environmental and economic and production challenges here, but they can't be seen in isolation. And that's the point that I keep kind of drumming home here. The real effects of these problems are most keenly felt in terms of their profound impact on social relations, on morality, on cosmological understandings, and so forth. So I think this case challenges us to think about the implications of climate change beyond its narrow dimensions as an environmental problem linked to livelihood and economy. And to really understand how the pressures that might come from climate change, among other things, they might be spurred by climate change, how these pressures ripple across all social and cosmological and political spheres. And this means that there's really no technocratic fix, much as we might sometimes hope there would be. So I think by better understanding what Jola are experiencing and how they're responding to these circumstances, we all might gain a little bit of insight into aspects of this problem and how to confront it, however differently configured here or elsewhere. So I'll stop there and open it up for any questions at all. Go back to that.
Questions?
So I was just curious what sort of either ideas or applications of adaptation you've seen in the Jola community in terms of how they're either thinking about or actually starting to deal with this issue of having not enough water for their crops, basically.
Right, so there's no one answer to that, and partly the responses to what is acknowledged as a common predicament. Everyone can articulate this problem very clearly. No matter who you ask it, they say, yes, there's not enough rain, we can't grow enough rice, we're in a fix. That they agree on. How to respond to it is as diverse as the Jola themselves. There's partly this comes out of kind of a political culture in which there's not kind of, it's a horizontal kind of political structure. There's no hierarchical leadership. So most decision-making actually happens at the family level. So each household is kind of experimenting in various ways of how to respond to this. Some of those responses include working harder. so that what was already a kind of arduous agricultural work regime took a lot of work. It always takes a lot of work to grow rice. It's a pretty hard crop to grow compared to cashews, say. People are working much harder, especially women are working a lot harder because a lot of the burden falls on them as far as provisioning goes. Another set of responses that I've seen have to do with, again, thinking ahead for their children and realizing that there's not a whole lot of hope for eking out a living based on a rice economy, sending their children to school. Now, school has not been a particularly popular option in this region until very recently, even in the time that I've been there. When I first started living there in early 2000s, 2001 to 2003, very few people sent their kids to school. Going back, that's been the biggest shift. And that means sending their kids away, because schooling in the region only goes up to 4th grade. If you go beyond 4th grade, you have to go either to the local town, which is about 50 kilometers away, down a dirt road, and then eventually to the capital city. And that has then shifted a whole lot of other dynamics in terms of who's actually raising their kids and what their kids kind of get up to in the town and all of these sorts of things, and whether they come back or not to help their families in the intensive kind of shortened rainy season. So schooling has been seen as a kind of way out. It's yet to be seen. It's too early to see whether that actually results in what they're hoping it does. Another set of responses involves different kinds of religious alternatives. So in seeing that some of those responses have been a kind of heightened attention to the sorts of rituals and ceremonies to try to repair the contract with Emitai, so increasing kinds of sacrifices at crucial spirit shrines. So there's some groups of people who do that, and then others opt out and say, we don't want to be constrained anymore by this sort of contract. It's not working. We're going to convert. And the conversion options in the region are, the longer standing one is a form of, believe it or not, pre-Vatican II Italian Catholic sponsored missionary, which has been in the region for a long time, but without very many adherents, but that's growing because it's seen as a different economic option. And then more recently, Protestant evangelical missionaries. So there's some opting out on the religious side that then leads to other sorts of economic alternatives, including growing cashews. So those are just a few examples. There's others, but there's a wide range.
You made a statement about it's not about the science, and so I'm just curious, when you grow one crop on a land for hundreds of years, how do they do that in a sustainable, like, don't they deal with nutrient reductions because they're not doing complementary planting, dealing with pests, diseases? In other words, so how has that system sustained itself for so long? What's the science behind that?
Yeah, so I'm so glad you asked that, because it gives me entree into highlighting, again, what's called this rice knowledge system. So I simplified things by saying there are these two species of rice. There are two species of domesticated rice, but the domesticated rice, the Arysa glaberrima, that's used in this region, that has been for a long time, there's over at least 300 different kinds of seed varieties within that, right? And women actually there's a very strict gender division of labor and knowledge in a rice agricultural system. Men are specialists in the irrigation and the maintenance of the rice paddies. Women are specialists in seed knowledge and in transplanting and harvesting. And so women are often deciding which seeds to plant and to broadcast depending on very kind of attuned understandings of different pest conditions, different moments in the season of variety, different amounts of rain at any given point, and there's real shifts even in terms of, we go back to one of the pictures of the rice paddies maybe, of where, so in the land tenure system, the paddies are, here we go, distributed in these sorts of parcels across different lineages. So you might have, your family might have a parcel here and a parcel in a different place, and you would broadcast different seeds there based on the very particular conditions of each parcel. So there's a range of seed selection options, but then there's also, between the forest and the paddies, there's also a very, very intricate system of fallowing and letting and recuperation. So in certain parts of the forest that are used as nurseries, there has been, that's changing now with increased pressure to grow rice in the upland areas, a process of letting certain sections of the forest remain untouched and regenerate. They become off limits and sacred and used for other purposes. often for up to 10 to 12 years, and then you come back to them. So there's lots and lots of processes of regeneration there. Again, all of these are under pressure now. So lots of different shifts within that. That's understood as kind of indigenous science. Paul Richards would put it that way. He's talked about this as, a lot of what's come out of the what we consider more scientific and technologically sophisticated agricultural approaches has often followed suit from indigenous African, scientific processes that have been underway for a long time. There's a lot more in there that we can talk about later.
Well, I have one other question, because a former student of mine went to the Peace Corps after graduating. By the way, speaking of which, another former student said the one thing she wished she had done when she wanted to do international work, and that she's having a hard time cracking that market, was the fact that she didn't go into the Peace Corps really compromised her abilities. So if you're thinking about working internationally, you might want to consider the Peace Corps. Anyway, having said that, she emailed me and she said, I don't know what to do. There's a locust outbreak and they're eating everything. They're eating the flowers off the mango trees. They're eating, there was nothing being spared by this locust outbreak. And so I'm kind of curious, in your time here, have you experienced anything quite like that? And what was it like for this community?
Absolutely. So there was actually a locust outbreak. So there's a recurrent locust outbreak usually around October of every year, even in the urban areas. And I remember being one of the first times that I was in the capital city, and it was the locust time of year, Grillo they're called there. And they really get like, it really is like what you imagine a locust outbreak to be. You're stepping, they were in everything. Like you couldn't take a step without locusts, and people are just harvesting them and so you're gross out of it. They're actually kind of not that bad to eat as long as they're fried nicely. But they're just like piles and piles of them everywhere. And in the rural regions, yes, absolutely, they were wiped out. The locust problems have increased, right, because of what has decreased in terms of integrated pest management systems. And that has come about largely because of the push to shift to the more drought-resistant hybrid seed, rice seeds that come out of the West African rice research, what's now called Africa rice, right, where they've created these hybrids, that a hybrid of the sativa and glaberrima that are supposedly hardier, but they're not as pest resistant. Some of them, they're working on it. There's a lot of different strains on that now. When I talk about glaberrima is the independently domesticated indigenous rice, indigenous species that has been cultivated for 3,500 years. There's very little glaberrima grown anymore. It has been replaced largely by different versions of sativa and now increasingly hybrids. So what was a kind of long-term process of figuring out the right kind of pest management systems through particular seed selection of glaberrima has also shifted, given the influence of seeds from the lab, right, that are being pushed and now increasing pests. The other thing about pest management, just to add a labor angle to it and a sort of family dynamic, how pests were managed, both pests and birds, right, at a certain moment in the agricultural cycle, one of the most important tasks is to, in the harvesting, right at the end before you harvest it and it's ripe, birds come in and start eating all the rice. And the job of shooing the birds away were for the little kids. You send your kids out, right, and there's a little platform for them to stand on, and their job, right, for the day is to shoo away the birds. It's a very important job. The kids are now being sent to school, and there's no one to replace that important kind of labor function within again, a family domestic sort of unit rice system. So they've seen an increase in pest problems and in almost ripe rice being harvested more by birds than by humans because of those sorts of shifts too. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Sure. As you talk about the different solutions that they're using right now, I think it would be interesting to hear more about the current structure and scale of the farms and how that affects the farmers' access to new expertise or financial resources that could help address the problem. So are the majority of the farms in the area individuals for their own sustenance, or is it local smallholder farms that are aggregating production for local consumption, or is there any presence of large-scale farms that could draw?
Large-scale farms.
Okay.
This is all. So you can't really think about farms in the same way that we have family farms here. in most of rural West Africa, in most of rural Africa overall, but certainly West Africa, you have villages, right? So population settlements surrounded by agricultural land. And that agricultural land might include forest, rice paddy, mangrove, other kinds of sort of bush environments. And so the agricultural land, depending on the land tenure system in each given place, is parceled out, usually on a lineage basis, right? So in this context, you have extended families, lineages. It's a patrilineal system, so you inherit your land through your father's line, and land is distributed to the agnatic kin, right, to the brothers and uncles in any given lineage, and then constantly redistributed as some people die, some people come of age. Constant redistribution, and there are many factors taken into account in that redistribution, like there's always, in any agricultural system, land. It's redistributed accordingly. So everyone gets some of each. There's also a very involved kind of complicated process of borrowing different lands. So there's lots of pledging and borrowing and all that. So land parcels are distributed quite widely, and then they're worked through both organized family labor. So a father and his sons will do certain labor within the family. A mother and the daughters will do some. And then moments of group work, again, organized along gender and age lines. So the Women's Work Association that I was a member of, we went and did collective work in each of the members' land areas at different moments in the agricultural work week, which is a 6-day work week, right? So all of that to say, there's no industrial aspect of this. It is a subsistence form of agriculture. So what does that lead to in terms of your question?
Yeah, so I was just saying, does that affect the access that they have to scientific expertise that could help, address some of the issues, or financial resources? Because in countries like Tanzania, you see some of the individual farmers kind of bundle their work together to produce more, so that it grows beyond subsistence farming to something where they can sell to larger scale buyers who then can help with different farming techniques that would address issues like resource scarcity.
So that's not happening with rice,
okay,
because that is embedded already in this kind of extended kinship and lineage system. That is happening in some ways in very small sort of development initiatives around, say, growing onions, right? This is the most recent initiative, tomatoes in another couple of villages nearby, where small grassroots development organizations have brought together collectives of large women who will grow in a collective sort of orchard or garden plot enough to bring to market. I mean, we're talking very, very small scale compared to some of the other efforts that you've seen elsewhere. This is still a very isolated area, so there's not really a lot of development investment in the area. In terms of gaining access to scientific expertise, so there's a lot that is going on, again, through AGRA, through the Gates-funded Green Revolution efforts there, and through long-standing kind of agricultural, scientific agricultural research centers. Africa Rice, which used to be the West Africa Rice Association, is now sort of continental-wide, is always developing new strains and new techniques to address some of these issues. But again, my understanding of how those have played themselves out is that they are focusing too much on the technical and supposed scientific side without seeing how those really can be put into a system that involves much more than just planting and growing rice, right? So there's not been a lot of acceptance of those methods because they don't actually address the issues that people here care about most.
So I can think of many reasons why somebody would not want to just grow one crop from the environmental, economical point of view, but also from the health point of view. I can imagine having a diet based on rice is not really good for you. So I was wondering what their diet is like. Do they grow any other crops to complement their diet? What kind of health effects do you see, and do they address them? Can you speak something about that?
So I always get this question, mostly directed at me, like every time I go, and then I come back and talk about what what one eats there. And everyone says, how can you just eat rice every day for every meal? And I always have to flip that question over, because from the perspective of people here, the idea that you wouldn't eat rice for every meal is just like, oh my God, you're starving. And I have wonderful anecdotes that attest to this, right? Where, like, one of the first times that I was in Guinea-Bissau, I, again, was eating rice every day for every meal, and I thought, oh, I'm going to make a treat for my family that I was living with at the time. This was before I was living in this village, and make them a non-rice meal. Like, it's going to be a big treat, right? And I went, and this was in the capital city, right? I went to the black market at the time and found some probably like expired, spaghetti, and everything that I could find to make this enormous spaghetti meal. And I went, and I cooked over charcoal, made this huge spaghetti meal for the whole family, and they ate it all up. And then they said, well, where's the food? so, and lots of stories like this. The opening anecdote of my book is about one of the main one of my closest friends in the region, who has this great opportunity to go to Portugal on a kind of a development gimmicky tour to sort of expose, tell the Portuguese possible philanthropic world what life is like, back in rural Guinea-Bissau. And she goes and, has, again, it's like this unbelievable opportunity to experience this very different way of life. And she comes back, and all she talks about was like, they didn't have any rice. They didn't have any rice. Like that. I wanted rice. I was so hungry. And of course, like, they're trying to introduce her to all this fabulous Portuguese food, and all she wanted was rice. So you have to kind of shift perspective on saying, how can they just eat rice? Like, it must be really, they must get bored. They don't get bored. They really just want rice. And that's not to say they don't, they're very happy to eat. Every time I come, I bring them a lot of other foods, because people have their particular things that they love. The father of my host family learned to love olives when the Portuguese colonial soldiers were there. They introduced him to olives, and so every time I come, I have a whole suitcase full of olives for him, and he'll eat them, but then, he'll mix them with the rice. So they are not bored of having rice every day. In terms of nutrition, this has also been a shift. Glaberrima, compared to sativa, actually has a higher protein content. It's not white rice. Like, we think of white rice as just sort of this food that doesn't have, it's just empty calories, right? It's not empty calories. It's actually quite nutritious. And they do have other forest foods that they will mix in with it. There used to be a lot more fish. They would put fish on top of the rice. There's a decrease in fish, again, because of the decrease in rains. So there's not as much fish, and a lot of other reasons too. They don't eat a lot of other kinds of animal proteins, except in a kind of ceremonial, like when a goat or a cow or a pig is sacrificed, meat will be distributed. But that's, again, less common now. So they're not bored with it. Are they healthy? Are they not healthy? It's the mixture. They can, you saw the pictures. There's no actual, it's not like there's no famine, right? I mean, look at the wrestling pictures. My mother, who is a micronutrient specialist and has spent her entire life working with USAID to get, to fortify foods, and she looks at these pictures and she's like, how can they be so healthy? It goes against everything she believes in, right? But they're, they are able to supplement with a lot of different forest products, but rice is what they eat. It is the form of food. So, yeah. But that is, the health issue is not an irrelevant one as this is changing.
Well, I think you've really changed our worldview today. I want to thank you so much for sharing with us.
Thank you.
And if you are a senior and this is your last Lunch and Learn, it was great having you. If you're thinking about careers, I'm sure Joanna would be happy to chat with you for a few minutes. Thank you again, and see you next year.